The key clicked in the lock with a cruel finality as Marcus stood in the doorway, his smug grin illuminated by the porch light. "That's it, little sister. Time to find somewhere else to live. My name is Emma Chen, and at 28 years old, I was being locked out of my childhood home by my own brother just days after our father's funeral. The same house where Dad had raised us after Mom died, where every wall held memories I couldn't bear to leave behind. But Marcus didn't care about memories. He only cared about what he could take. "You can't do this," I said, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. "Dad wanted this house split between us. You know that." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Really? Because that's not what his will says. Everything's in my name now. The house, the business, all of it. Dad knew you weren't cut out for any of this." I clutched my backpack tighter, the few belongings I'd managed to grab before he changed the locks weighing heavily on my shoulder. "That will is forged and you know it. Dad would never." "Dad would never what?" Marcus cut in, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Leave everything to his successful son instead of his failure of a daughter. Face it, Emma, you're nothing but a disappointment. Always have been." The words stung, but not as much as they used to. I'd spent years listening to Marcus tear me down, watching him manipulate our father with practiced ease. Dad had been sick for months before he passed, barely lucid in his final weeks. It was the perfect opportunity for Marcus to swoop in and change everything in his favor. What my brother didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment. For years, I'd watched him scheme and plot, always looking for ways to undermine me. I knew he'd try something like this eventually. I just hadn't expected him to move so quickly after Dad's death. "You really think you've won, don't you?" I asked, meeting his gaze steadily. His smirk widened. "I don't think I know. Now get off my property before I call the police." I turned to leave, but paused at the bottom of the steps. "One more thing, Marcus. Did you ever wonder why Dad insisted on those weekly dinners with his attorney? The ones you were always too busy to attend?" For just a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "What are you talking about?" "You'll find out," I said simply, then walked away into the night, leaving him standing in the doorway of what he thought was his victory. What Marcus didn't know, what I'd kept carefully hidden for months, was that those dinners weren't just social calls. They were meetings where Dad, in his more lucid moments, had carefully documented everything. Every transaction Marcus had manipulated, every document he'd altered, every lie he told to turn our father against me. Dad might have been sick, but he wasn't stupid. He'd seen through Marcus's act long before the end. I made my way to my car, parked around the corner where Marcus couldn't see it. As I slid behind the wheel, I pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mr. Harrison? It's Emma Chen. I think it's time we move forward with everything." "Are you sure?" The attorney's voice was gentle but firm. "Once we start this process, there's no going back." I thought about Marcus's smug face, about all the years he'd spent trying to destroy me, about how he thought he'd finally won. "I'm sure," I said. "Dad trusted us to handle this the right way. Let's make sure his real wishes are carried out." As I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. Marcus thought he'd left me with nothing. But in reality, he'd just walked right into the trap Dad and I had spent months setting up. He was about to learn that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones you should fear the most. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment, the one Marcus didn't know about, paid for with money I'd been quietly saving for years. I learned early on not to keep all my eggs in one basket, especially with a brother like Marcus around. My phone was already buzzing with messages from him, each one more demanding than the last. "What did you mean about Dad's dinners? Stop ignoring me and answer your phone. Whatever you think you know, you're wrong." I deleted them all without responding. Let him stew in his uncertainty for a while. He'd spent years making me feel small and worthless. Now it was his turn to wonder what was coming. I made my way to Mr. Harrison's office, where a small team was already gathered. They'd been working behind the scenes for months, gathering evidence, tracking paper trails, building an ironclad case against everything Marcus had done. "Good morning, Emma," Mr. Harrison said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Are you ready for this?" I nodded, pulling out a thick folder from my bag. Copies of all the documentation Dad and I had collected. "More than ready. What's our first step?" "Well," he said, spreading several documents across his desk, "your father was very thorough in his planning. He knew Marcus would try something like this after he passed, which is why he took such careful precautions. He pointed to a particular document, a true copy of Dad's will, properly notarized and dated just 2 months before his death. This is your father's actual will. The one Marcus filed is a forgery, and we can prove it. I leaned forward, scanning the contents. Everything was there, just as Dad had planned. The house and business were to be split equally between Marcus and me, with specific provisions to prevent either of us from forcing the other out. But that's just the beginning, Mr. Harrison continued, pulling out more papers. We also have evidence of financial fraud. Marcus has been embezzling from the family business for years. Your father suspected it, which is why he started keeping such detailed records. The evidence was damning: fake invoices, doctored books, money transferred to offshore accounts. Marcus had thought he was being clever, but Dad had seen through it all. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to act. So what happens now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mr. Harrison smiled grimly. Now we file everything with the court. The forged will, the fraud evidence, all of it. Marcus won't just lose his claim to everything. He'll likely face criminal charges. I sat back in my chair, letting it all sink in. This wasn't just about getting what was rightfully mine anymore. This was about justice, for me, for Dad, for everyone Marcus had ever tried to hurt or control. He's going to fight back, I said quietly. Of course he will, Mr. Harrison agreed. But we have something he doesn't: the truth, and all the evidence to prove it. As if on cue, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. This one was different though, more desperate. Emma, please. We need to talk. Whatever you think you know, whatever Dad told you, we can work this out. Don't do anything rash. I showed the message to Mr. Harrison, who raised an eyebrow. He's starting to realize he's in trouble. Are you ready for what comes next? This could get ugly. I thought about all the times Marcus had belittled me, all the ways he tried to convince Dad I was worthless, all the years of manipulation and cruelty. I'm ready, I said firmly. Let's show my brother exactly what his worthless little sister is capable of. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal activity. Mr. Harrison's team filed motions contesting the forged will, submitted evidence of Marcus's fraud to the district attorney's office, and began the process of freezing assets to prevent my brother from hiding or moving any more money. Marcus, predictably, didn't take it well. His messages became increasingly frantic, alternating between threats and desperate attempts at reconciliation. You have no idea what you're doing. Please, Emma, let's talk about this. You'll regret this, I promise you that. We're family. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I saved every message but didn't respond. Family had meant something to me once, but Marcus had destroyed that long ago. Now all that mattered was making things right. The first real confrontation came 3 days after I'd left the house. I was leaving Mr. Harrison's office when I saw Marcus waiting by my car, his normally perfectly pressed suit wrinkled, his face twisted with anger. So this is your game, he spat as I approached. You're trying to destroy everything I've built? I almost laughed at that. Everything you've built? You mean everything you've stolen? Everything you've lied about and manipulated to get your way? I did what I had to do, he shouted, taking a step toward me. Dad was weak, sentimental. He would have run the business into the ground trying to be fair to everyone. I made it stronger. By stealing, by forging documents and embezzling money, I kept my voice level, even as I noticed people starting to stare. That's not strength, Marcus. That's cowardice. His face reddened. You have no idea what it takes to succeed in this world. You're just like Dad, too soft, too trusting. I deserve everything I've taken. Well, I said, pulling out my phone, why don't we let the police decide that? His eyes widened as I pressed play on a recording app, capturing every word of his impromptu confession. He started, then stopped, realizing what he'd done. You always did talk too much when you were angry, I said quietly. Now get away from my car before I call security. He backed away slowly, his face a mask of hatred. This isn't over, Emma. You're right about that, I agreed. It's just beginning. As I watched him storm off, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The brother I'd once looked up to, the one I'd trusted and loved, was long gone. This man, this angry, desperate person, was all that was left. But I couldn't dwell on that now. There was still work to be done, and Marcus wasn't going to go down without a fight. I just had to make sure I was ready for whatever came next. The morning of the court hearing arrived crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the courthouse. I stood in the marble hallway, adjusting my blazer and trying to calm my racing heart. Mr. Harrison was beside me, reviewing last-minute details when I saw Marcus striding toward us, flanked by two expensive-looking attorneys. He'd lost weight since our confrontation in the parking lot. His designer suit hung looser on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. The past month had clearly taken its toll, but his arrogance remained intact. "Last chance, Emma," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Drop this ridiculous case now, and maybe we can still salvage something." I met his gaze steadily. "Salvage what, Marcus? Your reputation? Your freedom? Because both of those are about to disappear." His lawyers exchanged worried glances. They knew what was coming. The evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus' recorded confession had been the final nail in his coffin. "You think you've won," he sneered, though I could hear the tremor in his voice. "You're nothing but a what?" I cut him off. "A disappointment. A failure. You've called me every name in the book, Marcus. None of it matters anymore." Before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened. It was time. The next few hours were a blur of testimony and evidence. Mr. Harrison presented everything methodically: the forged will, the financial records, the documentation of years of fraud. With each new piece of evidence, I watched Marcus sink lower in his chair, his face growing paler. When they played the recording from the parking lot, he actually flinched. His own words echoed through the courtroom. "I deserve everything I've taken." His lawyers tried to object, to argue that the recording was obtained without consent. But it didn't matter. There was too much other evidence, too many papers with forged signatures, too many doctored financial records. The judge's ruling was decisive. "The will submitted by Marcus Chen is hereby declared fraudulent," she announced, her voice firm. "The authentic will, as presented by Emma Chen and verified by multiple witnesses, shall be enforced. Furthermore, given the evidence of extensive financial fraud, this court is referring the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution." I heard Marcus make a choked sound beside me, but I didn't look at him. I couldn't. This wasn't about watching him suffer. It was about justice. As we left the courtroom, I heard him calling after me. "Emma, please. You can't do this to me. I'm your brother." I stopped and turned to face him one last time. "You stopped being my brother the moment you decided I was worthless. Everything that's happening now, you did this to yourself." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The business had to be audited, assets had to be divided, and the house, our childhood home, had to be dealt with. Marcus was facing criminal charges for the fraud, and his reputation in the business community was shattered. I received countless calls from old family friends and business associates, all expressing shock at Marcus's actions. Many admitted they'd had suspicions over the years but have been too afraid to speak up. His charm and manipulation have fooled a lot of people. One evening, as I sat in Dad's old office going through papers, I found a letter he'd written to me shortly before his death. The paper was worn, as if he'd handled it many times before sealing it. "My dearest Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything has played out as we feared it would. I'm sorry I won't be there to help you through it, but I know you're strong enough to handle whatever comes your way. You always have been." Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. "I wanted to believe the best of your brother, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. The man he's become, that's not the son I raised. But you, Emma, you've grown into exactly the person I hoped you'd be. Strong, principled, and brave enough to stand up for what's right. The evidence we've gathered together will help you fight back, but remember, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice, about making things right. Never let bitterness make you cruel. That's what happened to Marcus, and look where it led him." I set the letter down, wiping my eyes. Dad had known, had always known, that it would come to this. He prepared me not just to fight back, but to do it the right way. 3 months after the court hearing, I stood in front of our childhood home, key in hand. The property division had been finalized, and I had decisions to make. I could sell it, start fresh somewhere else. But something held me back. This house held more than just memories of Marcus's betrayal. It held summer afternoons helping Dad in the garden, winter evenings by the fireplace with Mom before she passed, Countless small moments that had shaped who I was. As I walked through the empty rooms, I made my decision. I wouldn't sell. Instead, I would rebuild, not just the house, but everything else Marcus had tried to destroy. The family business needed restructuring, needed someone who could lead with integrity instead of greed. I could be that person. Dad had seen that potential in me, even when I hadn't seen it in myself. A week later, I received word that Marcus had taken a plea deal. He would serve time for the fraud, though not as much as he probably deserved. Part of me felt relief, not for him, but for myself. I could finally close this chapter and move forward. That evening, sitting in Dad's old office, my office now, I found myself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Marcus had thought he could break me, had spent years trying to make me believe I was worthless. Instead, he'd only made me stronger. The phone on my desk rang, another business matter needing attention. As I reached for it, I caught my reflection in the window. I didn't see the failure Marcus had tried to create. I saw what Dad had always seen, someone capable, strong, and ready to lead. Chen Industries, Emma speaking. I answered, my voice clear and confident. How can I help you? The rebuilding would take time, but I was ready. Marcus had tried to write my story for me, but in the end, I'd written it myself, and this was just the beginning. 6 months later, I sat in a garden behind the house, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. The business was thriving under new leadership, with transparent practices and ethical standards that would have made Dad proud. The house had been renovated, brightened, turned back into the warm home it was always meant to be. A letter arrived that morning from Marcus, his first communication since starting his sentence. I held it for a long time before opening it, not sure what to expect. Emma, it read, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to write this letter. But being here, having nothing but time to think, I've realized something. You were never the failure. I was. Everything I did, every lie I told, every scheme I created, it was all because I couldn't stand seeing how capable you really were. Dad saw it. He always saw it. And that drove me crazy. I wanted to be the successful one, the worthy one. So I tried to tear you down. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. The words touched something deep inside me, but they didn't change anything. Marcus had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. My phone buzzed, a reminder about tomorrow's board meeting. I had a presentation to finish, proposals to review, a company to run. Standing up, I took one last look at the garden Dad had loved so much. The flowers were blooming again, new life pushing through old soil. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes it's about proving them wrong by becoming exactly who you were always meant to be.